Hi there, this is my video assignment for 2D Old Testament literature, Latter Prophets, in which I'm asked to explain the role of a prophet in relation to the priesthood and the kingship. I think the prophet's role in both these situations can be summed up in one phrase: speak truth to power. In most kingdoms throughout history, the church and state have had to support one another because any threat to one ends up being a threat to both. The prophet challenges convention and upends structures that all people in authority have come to rely on. In some cases, the latter prophets, we see some of them have been called into the priesthood as well as into the role as prophet. This would have created some tension in the priestly class, I imagine. As a prophet, Isaiah would speak truth before kings of Judah. Even though he's presented as a friend and confidant of Hezekiah, he certainly would have found himself in tricky conversations speaking the truth of God to royalty. Jeremiah was born into a priestly family near Jerusalem, but his own family would end up opposing him. He withstood the royal establishment and he suffered for it. He speaks an irrevocable judgment against King Jehoiakim for burning a scroll. He spoke against foreign kings as well. He was what they call a royal messenger of a heavenly king during a time when earthly kings could not really be depended on. It's a truth to power situation. Ezekiel became a prophet at an age that he probably should have gone into the priesthood. That would seem to be a bit of a slight to the establishment. He then goes on to speak judgment against the current king of Judah as well as other kings. Just another example of speaking truth to power. So regarding Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the prophets of the Book of the 12, a few observations about how they relate to the priestly class. So to speak against false prophets, which they definitely did, meant to speak against people in authority who are claiming to speak for God. Any criticism of the religious life of Judah or Israel would have been an indictment against the establishment and their power. Joel speaks as though the temple is around, so his criticism would have been interesting because it would have faced not only the priests but their sacred place of worship. His words may in fact have been a liturgical work meant for the temple, meaning his job would have been especially tricky. In some of Joel's prophecy, he talks about sons and daughters dreaming dreams. What does that do? That takes important religious jobs and puts it in the hands of common folks, which decentralizes control. That's both tricky and dangerous to speak truth to power. Amos demonstrates that pedigree does not matter because it's a possibility, according to one way to read the text, that he was not a prophet until he was called to be. He had no special job until God told him to step up. The language here might actually indicate that he was already a prophet, but that he was called to disassociate himself from the prophetic establishment, which in a roundabout way claims that they were fake. Either way, truth to power. Micah speaks out against religious and civic leaders. That would have been a double dose of truth to power. Both Ezekiel and Zechariah were prophets, but were also priests, making their lives tricky as members of the establishment. One of Zechariah's visions sees God's special presence leaving the temple and surrounding Jerusalem like a wall of fire. And while that may seem like a prophecy of protection, it might have also sounded like the authority of the priesthood was being decentralized. The special presence of God was leaving the facility and was going out. Zechariah has a vision against the high priest. You can imagine that would have created some trouble for him. So Haggai's prophetic instruction, though it seems was pretty brief, it provided the framework for how to repair the temple when the people came back from exile. This demonstrates the prophet's authority in reestablishing the central place of worship for the people of God. Malachi would call the priesthood corrupt. Certainly truth to power. So regarding the prophets and how they relate to kings, a few observations. Almost all the prophets speak out against foreign states. Obadiah speaks out against Edom. Nahum speaks out against Nineveh. So we see judgment exists both at home but also abroad. And though we're unsure where he wrote it from, Hosea speaks out against the northern ruler Jeroboam. Amos and Hosea may have been speaking about the abuse of power that occurred and the abuse of privilege that occurred during the relative peace that was experienced while the Assyrian Empire was falling apart. I mean, think about that. Any criticism of the national life, even though things seem to be going well, criticizing that era when things seem to be going well is not just a criticism of the people, but the leaders of the people. Amos also hopes for a return to the united monarchy. And what does that mean in a roundabout way? Well, if the monarchy is going to be reunited, that means somebody's going to have to give up some of their power. And we all know how eager people in power are to give up their authority, right? So Amos would seek social justice for those that don't have it. That would be a threat to the status quo, for sure. He says that those that crush the poor will themselves be crushed. Truth to power. We also see that God uses the prophets to lift up foreign powers and even use the foreign powers to crush his own people. In Jonah, we see God having mercy on the hated Ninevites. Habakkuk tells us that God's people will be punished by outsiders. And finally, just to wrap all this up, Zephaniah 3:12 tells us that God will lift up the meek and humble. If that is the fate of the meek and the humble, what then will be the fate of the prideful and the arrogant? So in relation to the priesthood and the kingship, we see that the life of the latter prophets, and every prophet throughout history for that matter, the life of the prophets is a lonely life. It always is for those people who speak truth to power.